Welcome to True Crime Audio Pod, where we unravel the threads of the most disturbing true crime stories. In today's story, we delve into the chilling and bizarre case of Gerald Anderson, a nightclub singer with big dreams, whose life ended tragically in his Golden Hill apartment in May 1986. What began as a routine investigation for San Diego's Crime Team 4 quickly unraveled into a web of deception, violence, and unanswered questions. On the dim morning of May 13, 1986, San Diego's Crime Team 4 huddled in their so-called office, though the term felt generous. The cramped space barely accommodated its 4 desks, each pressed awkwardly against a different wall. When the officers swiveled in their chairs to confer, their knees nearly collided, a reminder of the close quarters they shared, both physically and professionally. Their task that day was grim and urgent, a murder investigation that had landed in their laps 2 days earlier, on May 11th. The murder, if one could call it that, was hardly newsworthy. It had warranted a mere 12-line mention buried on page 6 of the local paper, easily missed by even the most avid crime readers. But the lack of public interest didn't lessen the stakes for Team 4. In their world, the clock was always ticking, and this case was no exception. They all understood the unspoken truth: solve the case within 2 weeks, or it would likely fade into the backlog of unsolved mysteries, another cold file in a city full of them. Adding to the pressure was the reality that Team 4, as it currently existed, was on borrowed time. In just 2 weeks, most of its members would scatter to other assignments, leaving the investigation without continuity. Sergeant Hank Elias, the team's leader, carried the burden of keeping his squad focused. Among his officers was Detective Fred Dreiss, a veteran of 23 years with a reputation for quiet intensity and a razor-sharp mind. Dreiss had spent the last 8 years navigating the frenetic pace of homicide work, and it was wearing on him. The middle-of-the-night calls, demanding his immediate presence at yet another grim scene, had become a source of mounting frustration. His bitterness occasionally spilled into sardonic complaints. "Why can't they just murder each other at 9 in the morning?" he would mutter, exasperated yet resigned to the realities of his job. The relentless overtime didn't help. Each of San Diego's 4 crime teams took turns being on call for a week every month. During that time, the pressure to solve cases swiftly was suffocating. Even a seemingly straightforward domestic homicide with a suspect already in custody was no simple matter. There were family members to contact, on both sides of the crime, and hours of questioning to conduct. And far too often, the officers found themselves confronting baffling murders that seemed utterly devoid of motive. These required painstaking effort to tease out the hidden threads that could tie the crime to a reason, and ultimately, to the perpetrator. In most cases, money was the key. The team often had to secure search warrants for bank records, a process that was never as quick or straightforward as it should have been. Sorting through financial statements became an essential but tedious part of their work, a task that often felt like chasing shadows. Even when they unearthed financial motives, it was only the beginning of what promised to be a long and grueling road to justice. The courthouse was another thorn in their sides. When they weren't actively chasing leads or processing crime scenes, the officers of Team 4 found themselves tethered to court obligations. Trials were an endless cycle of waiting in hallways, waiting to testify, waiting to be called from standby status. It seemed as though they spent as much time at the courthouse as they did in the field, often summoned at the most inopportune moments. It wasn't uncommon for an officer to be deep into the grim work of collecting evidence at a homicide scene when their beeper went off. The shrill tone meant only one thing: drop everything and head to court. The tension between investigative duties and judicial responsibilities was a constant balancing act, one that took its toll on even the most seasoned detectives. For Team 4, the stakes of this latest case went beyond the victim or the perpetrator. It was about the unyielding demands of their profession, the battle against time, and the weight of knowing that every unsolved case was a failure that haunted them long after the headlines, if there were any, had faded. Detective Fred Dreiss was on the verge of leaving behind the grueling world of homicide investigations, and he made no effort to hide his relief. In just a couple of weeks, the long, sleepless nights and unrelenting pressure would no longer be his burden. His two partners, Detectives Thwing and Shively, were also preparing to move on. Thwing, the towering 6 feet 7 inches investigator with a booming, guttural voice, was heading to Homicide Team 2. Shively, worn to the bone like Dreiss, was transferring to Missing Persons. For all three men, the change couldn't come soon enough. Detective Thwing was a force of nature, known as much for his intimidating stature as for his astonishing recall of names, dates, and addresses. He had a mind that worked like a filing cabinet, capable of pulling out obscure details at a moment's notice. One such moment came when a detective from Chula Vista casually mentioned the name of a person they were trying to locate. Thwing, cigarette in hand, took a long drag, squinted in thought, and twisted his face into a grimace. He's 26 years old, lives at 2413 First Avenue, and works at the Job Corps, Thwing declared with absolute certainty. We questioned him 2 years ago as a witness in the Holmes murder. Gave us a little info, but I could tell he was holding a lot back. The Chula Vista detective stared at him, skeptical but intrigued. It didn't take long to confirm that Thwing's memory was dead on, down to the last detail. Moments like that had cemented Thwing's reputation among his peers. But even he had grown weary. With his partners leaving and Homicide Team 2 in need of an extra man, the decision to transfer was a natural one. Detective Shively, on the other hand, shared Dreiss's exhaustion in its purest form. Both men were worn down by years of relentless cases, but the weight of their work had been compounded by one type of investigation in particular, the border bandit murders. These cases had become a grim specialty for Team 4. The scenario was tragically familiar. Migrants from Mexico, desperate for a better life, would cross the border from Tijuana, often in small groups of 5 to 10. They carried with them all they had, usually no more than $200, enough to pay a smuggler to guide them past the immigration checkpoints along the coast. But lurking in the shadows were the border bandits, opportunistic killers who preyed on the vulnerable. The bandits would ambush the migrants, robbing them of their meager savings before silencing them forever on the desolate trails. For those who escaped, the cost of survival was silence. Fear of the authorities, coupled with the constant threat of deportation, meant that few ever reported the atrocities. Days, sometimes weeks, would pass before the bodies were discovered, abandoned and decomposing on lonely paths. By the time Team 4 arrived at the scene, evidence was often compromised. Other migrants, scrambling to cover their tracks as they continued their northward journey, would inadvertently destroy any remaining clues. What greeted the detectives was a recurring nightmare: mutilated, unidentifiable bodies and an absence of witnesses. These cases were not only emotionally draining but deeply frustrating. With so few leads, the chances of solving them were slim. For Dreiss, Thwing, and Shively, the border bandit murders had come to symbolize the futility that sometimes defined their work. The endless cycle of despair had driven all three men to the brink. Yet, despite their imminent departures, they felt the pull of unfinished business. There was one last case, still unsolved, that gnawed at them. They couldn't leave without cracking it. On the morning of May 11th, Aubrey Willis decided to stop by his friend Gerald Anderson's apartment. It was a casual visit, nothing out of the ordinary. But as Aubrey approached the second-story unit in Golden Hill, something immediately unsettled him. The front door was ajar. That door was always shut tight, locked as a matter of habit. Aubrey paused, staring at the opening, an uneasy feeling creeping over him. Golden Hill had once been a jewel of San Diego, a proud neighborhood boasting manicured homes and tree-lined streets. But the years had been unkind. The area was now marked by gang graffiti and the constant hum of illicit activity. DEA agents roamed the streets regularly, trying to clamp down on the drug trade that plagued the area. Most of the residents were hardworking, decent people, struggling to live peacefully despite the gangsters and addicts who cast long shadows over their lives. Aubrey knocked on the door, his heavy wraps pushing it open even wider. He stepped back, wary but curious, and called out, "Gerald! Gerald! Are you in there, dude?" "Hey, Gerald, it's Aubrey. What's up? They gonna steal you blind, leaving your door open." "Hey, Gerald!" The silence that greeted him only deepened his unease. Steeling himself, he stepped inside. The scene that met him froze him in his tracks. The apartment was chaos, a fight had clearly erupted here. He moved slowly through the front room, his eyes darting over the damage. The west window curtain was torn from its rod, a lamp lay shattered on the floor, and streaks of blood stained the walls, the floor, and the bed. In the bedroom, he stopped short, his breath caught in his throat. On the far side of the bed lay a body, face down, its hands and feet bound tightly together. Something was wrapped around the victim's neck, pulling the body into a grotesque angle. Aubrey's heart hammered in his chest as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The body seemed to match Gerald's build and complexion, but the sight was so surreal, so horrifying, he couldn't bring himself to confirm it. Panicked, Aubrey turned and fled from the apartment. He sprinted down the stairs and found a nearby payphone, his trembling hands barely managing to dial 911. Within minutes, police cars arrived, their lights casting eerie flashes across the front of the building. Officers entered the apartment cautiously, searching for additional victims or suspects. Finding none, they quickly called for the homicide team. An hour later, detectives Hank Elias, Fred Dreiss, Thwing, and Shively arrived. Their grim work began as soon as they stepped through the door. They moved methodically, examining the scene with practiced eyes, noting every detail of the disorder and destruction. The body on the floor was that of a slender black male, approximately 6 feet tall. The victim was dressed in an unexpected garment, a black silk camisole with red trim. The material caught Detective Thwing's attention. As he picked up a corner of the fabric, running it between his fingers, he smirked and broke the tension with a macabre comment. "Excellent. Do you like it, Fred?" Detective Dreiss was busy speaking into his tape recorder, narrating every observation. He cataloged the room's temperature, the condition of the lights, and the location of every disturbed object. Dreiss glanced up briefly at Thwing's comment, gave a small nod, and returned to his work, his focus unshaken. The scene was a study in disarray. A VCR cord dangled uselessly from the wall outlet, the recorder it once powered was missing. A suitcase lay discarded in the middle of the room, pulled from the closet but left behind. The contents of drawers were scattered across the floor. Blood smears told a story of violence, but it was one the detectives would have to piece together step by step. For Elias, Dreiss, Thwing, and Shively, this was just another grim chapter in a long history of violent investigations. But as they worked through the details of the scene, one thing was clear: Gerald Anderson's murder wasn't random. There was a story here, and it was their job to uncover it. A framed photograph of Gerald Anderson sitting on the living room table confirmed what the detectives had already suspected: the body on the bedroom floor was his. While an autopsy would later provide confirmation, the officers surmised that Anderson had likely died from strangulation, though the possibility of a fatal beating hadn't been ruled out. As the team surveyed the scene, one detail left them perplexed: the victim's black silk chemise. Cases involving a homosexual or a transvestite victim were notoriously difficult to investigate. Such crimes often followed a troubling pattern. A victim might approach a stranger in a bar, hoping for a night of uninhibited passion, only for that encounter to take a tragic turn. Frequently, the person accompanying the victim would be unaware of their companion's true identity. Upon discovering it, the situation would devolve into rage, and more often than not, the outcome was lethal. These cases were hard to crack. The perpetrators rarely left a trail. Later that afternoon, Team 4 concluded their initial examination of the crime scene. Aside from the nightgown the victim was wearing, there were no other women's items in Anderson's bedroom. This absence struck Sergeant Elias as particularly strange. Genuine transvestites, he knew from experience, often had wardrobes brimming with flamboyant clothing and accessories. Anderson's room contained no such collection. Yet, a closer inspection of the second bedroom yielded a surprise: a closet full of women's clothing. But this wasn't the kind of wardrobe that might belong to a drag performer. The items were ordinary, practical, distinctly unlike the showy attire typically associated with a transvestite lifestyle. This discovery strongly suggested that a woman lived in the apartment with Anderson. Detective Shively floated a theory, albeit a far-fetched one. Could the roommate have come home, found Anderson wearing her nightgown, and flown into a murderous rage? The idea was dismissed almost as quickly as it was suggested. Anderson, while slim, was also muscular and more than capable of defending himself against an angry woman. As the detectives continued to explore possible scenarios, the mystery deepened. Then, the front door opened. Anderson's roommate, later identified as Naomi Smith, had returned home. She was calm but visibly shocked as officers allowed her to take a look around the apartment. When asked if she noticed anything missing or out of place, she mentioned a few items. Naomi was then escorted to police headquarters for an extended interview. Over the course of several hours, she shared her story. She was married to a sailor who was currently deployed on a cruise. She and Anderson were roommates, she explained, sharing the apartment strictly on a rent-only basis. There was no romantic relationship between them. According to Naomi, Anderson worked as a nightclub singer. He dreamed of one day catching the attention of a record label and making it big in the music industry. Detective Thwing, ever the blunt conversationalist, asked if Anderson's talent was enough to make him famous. "Not really," Naomi replied. "He was all right for the bars he performed in, but not good enough to make a record." Naomi claimed she had no idea that her roommate was homosexual or that he sometimes dressed in women's clothing. She added that several items were missing from the apartment, including a VCR, 2 suitcases, and some of her jewelry. The missing items raised more questions than answers. Was the robbery the primary motive, or was it staged to divert attention from the real reason for Anderson's murder? As the detectives listened to Naomi's account, they couldn't shake the feeling that the case was far more complicated than it first appeared. The pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit, and the answers, they suspected, were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. After hours of questioning, Detective Thwing drove Naomi Smith back to her apartment. The investigation at the crime scene had been thorough. The entire apartment had been meticulously photographed, dusted for prints inside and out, and logged in exhaustive detail. Now, the detectives needed to piece together what they had gathered and figure out their next moves. Back at the office, the homicide team convened to review their findings. Sergeant Hank Elias flipped through his notes, methodically addressing the officers around the table. Every witness available had been questioned, and while the detectives had a clearer picture of what had happened, they still lacked the critical clues needed to solve the case. The autopsy had confirmed what they had suspected. Gerald Anderson had died from asphyxia caused by strangulation. A phone cord had been cruelly wrapped around his neck, binding him to his limbs, leaving him immobilized and defenseless. The medical examiner noted that Anderson had been savagely beaten, his body bearing the marks of brutal force, but the blows weren't enough to have killed him outright. It was the strangulation that had ended his life. Sergeant Elias assigned new tasks to the officers. Leads were dwindling, but there was still work to do. Each detective received a specific objective, follow-ups to conduct, evidence to cross-check, and angles to pursue. Before concluding the meeting, Elias reminded the team that their time was short. Transfers were imminent, and he wanted this case closed before they all scattered to their new assignments. The officers nodded in agreement, their collective determination palpable. Yet, despite their resolve, the weight of the deadline loomed heavily over them. But the urgency wasn't enough. The transfers came as scheduled, and the detectives dispersed to their new roles across various units. The momentum of the case faltered. Without the cohesive efforts of Team 4, the investigation into Gerald Anderson's murder slowed to a crawl. Days turned into weeks, then months, and the case seemed to vanish into the pile of unsolved homicides, just another cold file in a city plagued with crime. The brutal murder of Gerald Anderson, once the center of Team IV's focus, now stood as a stark reminder of the cases left unresolved when time and resources ran out. Frank Martinez was an 18-year veteran of the police force, known for his meticulous attention to detail and a sharp sense of humor that lightened even the darkest of cases. At 5 feet 8 inches and a solid 250 pounds, he was an imposing figure. With his broad chest, massive arms, and almost non-existent neck, Martinez exuded physical strength. As a lineman for the San Diego Police football team, he brought his toughness to the field during annual charity games every January. Though the football games were simple affairs, his police work was anything but. Martinez had built a reputation for being decisive and intelligent, carefully analyzing every situation, whether on the gridiron or in a patrol car. He had excelled in vice, working both undercover and investigative assignments, before transitioning to robbery. Now, he found himself in homicide, ready to tackle the challenges ahead. Joining him on Team 4 were Bob Lopez and Vince Villalvazo, detectives who had previously made their mark by prosecuting gangsters across San Diego. The team was led by Sergeant Hank Elias, a sharp and charismatic leader who had risen through the ranks of homicide before taking and acing the sergeant's exam. Following a brief stint in patrol, Elias returned to homicide, now at the helm of Team 4. Elias was known for his wit and confidence. His rugged good looks were marred only by a bent nose and a scar, a souvenir from a Hell's Angel wielding a ratchet handle back in 1974. Despite these imperfections, he had a commanding presence that inspired confidence in his team. When Team 4 was assembled, they wasted no time diving into the cases assigned to them. The squad worked tirelessly, meticulously gathering evidence and presenting their findings to the district attorney for prosecution. But Sergeant Elias also had a knack for revisiting older, unsolved cases. On a July morning, about 2 months after Gerald Anderson's body was discovered, Elias reopened Anderson's file and began doling out new assignments to the team. One lead in particular caught his attention. A caller had tipped off the police, claiming to know someone who had information about Anderson's killer. The potential informant, a man who went by the name Bo Peep, was reportedly staying at a rundown hotel in the city's seediest neighborhood. Elias handed the folder to Martinez with a smirk. "Frank, there is someone named Bo Peep who needs to be questioned." He's in a sleazy hotel. You will fit in very nicely. Go to it, he quipped. Martinez, joined by Detective Lopez, headed to the hotel. It was every bit as grimy and unwelcoming as they had expected. When they finally tracked down Bo Peep, they found a young man, just 26 years old, dressed in flashy clothes and dripping with gold chains. His moist eyes darted nervously, and his big, tobacco-stained teeth glinted as he spoke. Martinez decided to approach the situation with a calm demeanor. He knew that gaining the man's trust, or at least his cooperation, was key. I know you know about the case, Martinez began, his tone measured and almost friendly. I want to give you the opportunity to help us out and help society stop someone from getting away with murder. But Bo Peep wasn't interested in playing the good citizen. His eyes narrowed, and his lip curled into a sneer. I don't care about no stupid society, he shot back, his voice dripping with disdain. They ain't never did nothing for me. Screw 'em. I don't know nothin'. Screw it, man. Detective Martinez snapped his notebook shut and leaned back in his chair, the silence in the room stretching unbearably. The weight of unspoken words seemed to press down on Bo Peep, who avoided Martinez's steady gaze. At last, Martinez broke the stillness, his voice low and deliberate. A man has been killed. Several people know who did it. And Bo Peep, you know the name of someone who knows the name of the murderer. Whether you like it or not, that makes you an accessory. You don't have a choice. Bo Peep shifted uncomfortably, his posture defensive as he sneered back. There is nothing you can do. This is some humbug trip you layin' on me. Martinez didn't flinch, his tone sharpening as he leaned forward. I will charge you as an accessory. There will be a trial. I will bring in the person who gave me your name, and that person will testify. The jury will deliberate, and they will find you guilty. You'll go to jail for a year. Meanwhile, the murderer will still be out there, laughing. Is that what you want? You in jail and the killer walking free? Is it worth it? The room seemed to shrink around Bo Peep as Martinez's words landed. He sat motionless, unblinking, the defiance in his expression cracking under the pressure. After a long pause, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled cigarette pack, and lit one with shaky hands. "God damn," he muttered, shaking his head. "I ain't did nothin', and I'm the some bitch who's goin' to prison. God damn. Justice, my ass." The room hung in silence for a moment before Bo Peep finally caved. With a resigned sigh, he gave Martinez the name of a woman who allegedly knew the killer. When the detectives returned to their car, Martinez slid behind the wheel, glancing at Lopez with a rare grin spreading across his face. That was close, wasn't it? Martinez said, the tension from the encounter still fresh. Sure was, Lopez replied. You could tell he's been to prison before. And I would have sent him there again, Martinez said, his voice steely as he started the engine. He can go play games with someone else. With that, the detectives drove off, another piece of the puzzle in hand, ready to chase down the next lead in the hunt for Gerald Anderson's killer. It took nearly 2 days for the detectives to track down the woman Bo Peep had named. She was hesitant from the outset, her demeanor guarded and her reluctance palpable. Fear was her reason. She said she wanted justice but didn't know if she could bear the risks. Her estranged spouse, a small-time drug dealer of little note, had left her to care for their 3 children alone. She feared that speaking out could put them all in danger. Detective Martinez, aware of her apprehension, adopted a softer approach during the interview at headquarters. He eased into the conversation by asking about her background, and soon discovered they had shared a similar upbringing. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, just blocks apart, and attended the same high school. As they talked, they found common ground in the people they both knew, a shared connection that Martinez hoped would encourage her to open up. Despite his efforts, the woman remained tight-lipped. Martinez tried to reason with her, appealing to her as a mother. He pointed out that her children's future might mirror their father's if she didn't take steps to protect them now. He asked her if she wanted better for them, a chance at a life far removed from danger and despair. He could see the cracks forming in her resistance, the barriers of silence beginning to weaken. Sensing her wavering, Martinez pressed on, emphasizing the gravity of the case. But just as it seemed she might speak, she stiffened again, her fear reasserting itself. Desperate, Martinez resolved to do whatever it took, even if it meant begging. He would later admit that he was prepared to drop to his knees in the small interrogation room if it would make her talk. Then, without warning, her eyes welled up. Martinez froze, watching her intently as the first tear slid down her cheek, then another. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Finally, the dam broke. "Bobby Gray," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Martinez leaned back in his chair, his entire body exhaling with relief. His shirt clung to him, damp with sweat, and his forehead gleamed under the harsh lighting. Through her tears, the woman explained what she knew. Bobby Gray had confided in her about the night of the murder. According to her, Gray had met someone he thought was a woman at a bar. The two went back to the individual's home, but it didn't take long for Gray to discover the woman was, in fact, a man. The revelation sparked an altercation that escalated quickly. She recounted how Gray had tied the man up in a fit of anger and left. Martinez listened intently, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Once the woman finished her account, Martinez arranged for her to be escorted home safely. Returning to the office, he found Sergeant Elias and shared the breakthrough. "Bobby Gray is our guy," Martinez said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Elias raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't too awful, was it?" Martinez let out a wry laugh. "Sure. About as easy as doing oral surgery with a cutting knife and pliers." After sitting at his desk, Martinez ran a quick search on the name, Bobby Ray Gray, a 35-year-old with a history that was, predictably, less than stellar. Gray's record littered the county's database. The charges ranged from petty theft to loitering, often involving aimless drinking with other do-nothings in liquor store parking lots. Despite his unremarkable profile, Bobby Ray Gray had now become the central figure in a murder investigation. Team 4 finally had a name, and with it, a new path to pursue. Gerald Anderson's killer was no longer a shadow, he was a man, and the hunt to bring him to justice was now fully underway. Other records painted a fuller picture of Bobby Ray Gray's past. He had been arrested several times for theft, a career criminal of petty offenses. But the most convenient piece of information Detective Martinez uncovered was that Bobby was already in custody, sitting in the county jail on a robbery charge. Martinez couldn't help but grin as he shared the news with Detective Lopez, who glanced at his watch. "Right about now, the inmates are probably eating dinner," Lopez said. Martinez nodded. "Let's grab a bite ourselves, then go have a chat with Bobby Gray." By 6 p.m., the two detectives were walking into the Central Detention Facility at 222 West C Street in downtown San Diego. The building loomed against the evening skyline, a fortress of concrete and steel. Inside, they filled out the pink intake sheet that detailed Bobby's information, including his cell unit number, as well as their own names, badges, phone numbers, and their agency details. They moved through a barred door into the weapons locker, where they relinquished their guns, handcuffs, and bullets. Then they proceeded past another steel door to the warden's station, presenting their police identification cards. The warden handed them a yellow laminated jail identification card, instructing them to wait in one of the interrogation rooms. The room was stark, lit by the harsh fluorescent glow of overhead lights. Martinez and Lopez waited for nearly 10 minutes before a scruffy deputy escorted Bobby Gray inside. Gray was a wiry man with a rough edge, his expression a mixture of indifference and irritation. As he sat down, he immediately asked for a cigarette. Neither detective had one to offer, but Bobby didn't seem bothered. With a practiced motion, he reached into his sock and pulled out a single, slightly bent cigarette. Lighting it, he took a long drag, his eyes shifting lazily between Martinez and Lopez. Martinez leaned forward and began the conversation. "Bobby, you're in here for burglary," he said calmly. "Detective Lopez and I? We're not burglary detectives." Bobby exhaled a stream of smoke, his gaze now fixed on Martinez. "So what?" he said with a shrug. Martinez kept his tone steady. "We're homicide detectives, Bobby." Another drag. Another shrug. "So?" Martinez didn't flinch. "We're here to talk to you about a case we're investigating." Bobby leaned back, unfazed. "Do what you want." "I don't know nothing about no homicide," he replied flatly. Before they could continue, Martinez explained that he had to advise Bobby of his rights. Bobby, clearly familiar with the process, waved him off. Yeah, I know my rights," he said, impatiently flicking ash from his cigarette. "I'll talk." With that, the interrogation began. The air in the room was heavy with cigarette smoke and tension as the detectives prepared to delve into the details of Gerald Anderson's murder. They had their suspect in front of them, and now it was time to see if Bobby Ray Gray was ready to talk. Detective Martinez maintained a calm, composed demeanor, but internally, he could hardly believe his luck. Bobby Gray, without hesitation, had agreed to talk. "Okay, guys, here's what happened," Bobby began. His account unfolded slowly, with the two detectives exchanging subtle glances but keeping their reactions in check. Martinez quietly jotted notes as Bobby described the events of that night. According to Bobby, he had been at a bar on Market Street when a woman approached him and offered him drinks. Over the course of an hour and a half, the two talked, laughed, and drank. Eventually, the woman invited him back to her place. Bobby, not one to refuse free drinks or an invitation, agreed, and the pair took a cab to her apartment on B Street. Once inside, the woman told Bobby to get comfortable and get into bed while she took a shower. Bobby followed instructions, undressed, but kept his underwear on. He lay down on his stomach and, lulled by the alcohol, quickly fell asleep. Bobby's voice grew more serious as he recounted what happened next. He said he woke up to the sensation of someone on top of him and something sharp pressed against his neck. Groggy and confused, Bobby initially thought it was the woman's acrylic nail. Martinez couldn't help but recall, silently, that the victim, Gerald Anderson, had normal fingernails, short and unadorned. Bobby said he then felt his underwear being pulled down and a lubricant rubbed on his anal area. Startled, he turned to look and saw that the sharp item against his neck wasn't a nail, it was a knife. "I thought I was gonna get murdered," Bobby said, his voice still carrying a hint of the fear he described. Instinct took over. Bobby said he rolled over and yanked at the hand holding the knife, initiating a violent struggle. In the chaos, the assailant's wig fell off. It was at that moment Bobby realized the woman he'd gone home with was, in fact, a man. Fueled by rage and panic, Bobby started throwing punches. The fight escalated as he grabbed a lamp and smashed it over Anderson's head. Then, he grabbed a phone and did the same, striking him until he collapsed. Once Anderson was down, Bobby said he tied his hands and legs with the phone cord. Afterward, Bobby claimed he took a shower to wash off the blood, got dressed, and began gathering items from the apartment. He glanced at the clock and guessed it was between 5 o'clock and 6 a.m. when he called a relative to pick him up. While waiting, Bobby decided to take a VCR, a jewelry box, and anything else of value he could find. He stuffed the items into a suitcase from the closet. When his ride arrived, Bobby said he gave his relative some of the items he'd taken and later traded the VCR for cocaine. That, he claimed, was the extent of his involvement. Lighting another cigarette, Bobby leaned back and exhaled slowly. And that's how it went down. That dude was alive when I left. Martinez pressed him for details. He asked for the name of the taxi company that had taken them from the bar to the apartment. Bobby provided it without hesitation. When asked about the knife that had been held to his neck, Bobby said he'd tossed it out but couldn't remember where. Throughout the interview, Bobby maintained his innocence regarding Anderson's death. "I didn't murder nobody," he said firmly, repeating the phrase more than once. The detectives listened in silence as Bobby's words settled in the room. The story, while detailed, raised as many questions as it answered. Whether Bobby was telling the whole truth remained unclear, but one thing was certain: Gerald Anderson's murder investigation had just taken a significant turn. The day after Bobby Gray's confession, Detectives Martinez and Lopez updated Sergeant Oli's. The consensus was unanimous: Bobby's story was self-serving at best and outright fabrication at worst. The details seemed tailor-made to set up a claim of self-defense. If a jury believed it, Bobby could walk free. Their immediate task was to put Bobby's narrative under a microscope. The first stop was the cab company he mentioned. However, their investigation quickly hit a dead end. Records showed that no taxi had picked up anyone near the bar on the night Bobby claimed he and the victim had met. The detectives turned to the streets, attempting to locate witnesses who might have seen Bobby with a lady that night, but the time lapse was too great. No one could recall such an encounter. The knife, central to Bobby's self-defense story, was another glaring issue. The detectives agreed it was implausible. Not only had no knife been found at the crime scene, but Bobby's claim that he had tossed it away was equally dubious. Why discard the single piece of evidence that could have substantiated his story? Moreover, Bobby hadn't been so panicked or traumatized that his memory failed him. He had the presence of mind to shower, gather valuables, and leave in an orderly fashion. Further investigation led them to Bobby's relatives, where they recovered an empty suitcase and a jewelry box. When presented to Naomi Smith, Gerald Anderson's roommate, she immediately identified the jewelry box as hers, though she couldn't say the same for the suitcase. The wig found at the crime scene was another matter. Naomi recognized it as hers, confirming it had been in her possession before the murder. The detectives then turned their attention to the bar where Gerald Anderson performed. There, they were met with a unanimous statement: Anderson was never in drag while performing and wasn't known to dress in drag at any other time. To the bar's patrons and staff, the idea that Anderson was a homosexual seemed completely out of character. This revelation deepened the mystery surrounding the black negligee found on the victim. Naomi Smith was adamant it wasn't hers, and none of Anderson's belongings hinted at any interest in feminine attire. The detectives were left with one conclusion: Bobby's version of events was riddled with lies. Detective Martinez compiled the investigative findings into a comprehensive report and handed it off to the district attorney's office. Deputy DA Patricia Cookson was assigned to prosecute Bobby Gray. After reviewing the evidence, Cookson filed murder charges and set dates for the arraignment, preliminary hearing, and trial. While Bobby sat in jail, he seemed to weigh his chances. Perhaps he consulted with a jailhouse lawyer, or maybe he spent long hours contemplating the prosecution's case against him. It was evident that Bobby's defense, his dubious tale of self-defense, was full of holes. In the end, before the preliminary hearing even began, Bobby Gray made a decision. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, avoiding a trial entirely. The court sentenced him to 15 years to life for the brutal killing of Gerald Anderson. In the months that followed, Detective Frank Martinez was promoted to sergeant and transitioned to the patrol division, his career in homicide ending on a high note. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hank Elias continued his efforts with Team 4, frequently revisiting cold cases and handing them to his detectives, always determined to give unresolved murders a second chance at justice.